Hi everyone, welcome to this crash course on Django. Just before we get into it, a quick note on the project is that the Django version being used is 2.1.2, which compared to the current version of 2.2.6 doesn't have any major changes, so you should be good to go. And if you'd like to get the final project files for the course, you can just go to our website, justdjango.com. You can head over to courses and the Django crash course. And there you'll be able to download the course files right here. And if you're interested in becoming a better Django developer, then do check out this website, as there are many courses here that teach a lot more advanced concepts. But other than that, enjoy this one. Welcome to this course on getting started with Django. In this video, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction of what Django actually is and the kind of things that you can expect to be building with it. So I'm here on their website, which is djangoproject.com. And here they just give us a little run through of what Django actually is. So it says Django makes it easier to build better web apps more quickly and with less code. And it says here that it is a high-level Python web framework. Now, the term high level basically just means that it covers a lot of the basic things for you, and it'll explain that further in this paragraph as well. It says it encourages rapid development and clean, pragmatic design. Built by experienced developers, it takes care of much of the hassle of web development. That's basically what high level means, and that's so that you can focus on writing your app without needing to reinvent the wheel. It's free and open source, and that's a really powerful statement that it's made there. And as you jump into Django, you'll see that it does exactly that. So just some things about it: it's ridiculously fast. So it says it's been designed to help take applications from concept to completion, and this is very true, as you'll see. It's reassuringly secure, so it helps avoid many common security mistakes, and it's exceedingly scalable. Some of the busiest sites on the web leverage Django's ability to quickly and flexibly scale, and we'll see some examples of this in a second. But ultimately, this is the Django website, so if you'd like to learn even more about it, you can always come here. You can click Get Started with Django to get started with their basic tutorial. And one other thing that is extremely special about Django is its documentation. So if we click here on this documentation link, then here it brings you to their documentation. And this is undoubtedly some of the best documentation you'll find, not just for Python, but for any kind of framework. And you can even come down here and download a PDF version of this entire documentation, and it's just under 2,000 pages. So that just gives you an idea of how in-depth they've gone to explain everything they've done. And so that really helps in learning Django, because basically everything is referenced inside their documentation, and you can always come back here and read about those concepts if you're getting stuck. And so to end off, let's just go and look at some of the top websites that are already using Django. And so just with a quick Google, you can see a couple of those companies like Bitbucket, Instagram, Mozilla Firefox, Pinterest, NASA, The Onion. These are some pretty big names, and you can go into some of these links here to see what other sites are using them. But I'm sure you get the picture, which is that Django is actually being used by a lot of busy websites. And that pays testimony to what it was saying about being extremely scalable. Because if sites like these that host millions of people are able to make use of the software, then most likely it will meet your requirements as well. In the next one, we're going to talk a little bit more about the requirements before getting started with this course. So before jumping into the course, we're just going to talk a little bit more about the prerequisites before getting started. And so there are mainly just two prerequisites. The first is that you have access to the internet and a computer. The specs of the computer do not need to be outstanding. Something just around 4 gigs of RAM and an i3 processor will definitely meet your requirements. And the second is that you have a substantial knowledge of Python already. And we're not going to be covering Python in this course. This course is purely focused on getting started with Django, which is built with Python. And so if you are not familiar with Python, then you're not going to grasp this at all. So what I suggest you do is start by completing the other Python courses that are recommended before getting started with this. And once you finish those courses and you've been able to implement Python in many different applications, not just basic object-oriented programming scripts, but scripts in a variety of usages, such as basic machine learning, working with data, visualizing, working with databases, or even web scraping. Any kind of application of Python will really help you just to understand that language. And once you've gotten to that point where you're competent in understanding how Python works entirely, then Django becomes available as an option. Now, sometimes it can be difficult to gauge exactly when you are ready to make that jump. And so I would say that if you are able to understand object-oriented programming in Python, and you can watch the course that we provide, which takes you through from the beginner level to object-oriented programming. But once you finish that, what I suggest you do is you go to Project Euler. Now, Project Euler is basically a series of challenges that require mathematical and programming to solve them. And you can just go to projecteuler.net, and I'm here on the About page, and it just talks a little bit about what the problems are about, and basically the culture of not sharing the answer with anyone, and that they don't provide the answers either. And you'll only know if the answer is correct by submitting it, and it will tell you whether that answer is correct or not. Now, there are over 600 problems that they provide on this website, and these problems are not just basic problems of how to run a for loop and record the answer at the end of it. They require algorithmic design and are quite challenging and do require a little bit of maths to get a better insight to these problems. But the whole gist of it is that if you don't understand where to even start with some of these problems, it forces you to research a lot, and that's what you're going to have to do if you're working with Django or anything in programming. So what I would suggest is that if you're able to get at least 18 out of the first 20 questions here, then I would suggest that you are definitely ready to take on learning Django. And I would even reinforce that you only solve these problems using Python. That way you can really put your Python skills to the test and see if you're able to actually use Python to solve problems. Now, this isn't the only website that you can do this with. There are some other websites that provide programming problems, but this website specifically is good because it's not only about programming, it's actually about maths. And even though that might seem unrelated to Django, it's more the aspect of actually solving a problem and not just creating a script that returns no value to you. So this is the best guideline I can give you as to know when you're ready to get started with Django. Once you're at this point, I guarantee you'll definitely find learning Django to be a lot easier, because if you just jump straight into it, even after you've just watched videos on Python, this is not going to be easy for you to learn. So definitely make sure that you know your Python, solve some problems with it first, and then when you come back here, we're ready to get started. So now we're ready to get started with actually learning Django, and how I'm going to be working through these tutorials is using VS Code, which is my IDE. You're free to use whichever IDE you find best for you, whether that's Sublime Text, Brackets, or PyCharm, or anything like that. Don't feel pressured to use VS Code. But so once you've got everything set up in your IDE and you're ready to go, then we can get started with installing Django. Now we can simply do this just by pulling up a terminal, and we can just say pip install Django. And if you're installing it for the first time, then it's going to run through those installations for you. However, for me, it's saying that my requirement has already been met because I already have Django installed. But to ensure that we get the latest version, we can just say install Django -- upgrade. Cool, and then it says it's successfully installed Django version 2.1.4. Your version most likely could be different depending on what time you're watching this. But as long as your version is above version 2, then you should be good to go. And so we can just clear this terminal out, and I'll just drag it down a bit. So now that we have Django installed, we can use it to create a project. And Django helps us to get these projects up and started by using a specific command. And so what we can do is we can say Django-admin start project, and then we give our project a name. So let's call our project tutorial, and then you see that it creates a tutorial folder here, and let's just walk through some of the contents in this folder. So you can see you've got another folder in there called tutorial, and then you have a manage.py file. Inside the tutorial folder, you've got an init file, the settings file, a URLs file, and a WSGI file. And so this tutorial directory, this directory inside the upper level tutorial folder, this is kind of like the root of your project. It holds everything telling Django where to start. So like your settings, your URLs, and your WSGI, which is basically telling Django about how to run your server. Now what I'm going to do is rename the top level folder to be called SRC, which stands for source. And this is kind of like an indication of where your project lies. So everything inside the source folder is going to be related to our project. And that way we know exactly where everything is being stored. Now this is actually already enough for us to quickly get our project running and actually view it in the browser. And so this brings me to one of the most important concepts in Django, which is migrating. Now here inside the manage.py file, basically what this file is doing is it's checking, does your system have Django installed? And if it doesn't, then it's just going to raise an error saying that it couldn't import Django and that's why it couldn't run your application. Now when you use the script to run your application, it's also going to do some checks. And one of those checks is to see if the database exists and if all the migrations to the database have been performed. Now these migrations are basically to take your code and convert them into actual tables in your database. And if you haven't made those migrations, then you're going to run into some problems. Now what we can do is we can change into the source directory. And if we list everything out, then you can see we have the manage.py file and the tutorial folder. And we can use the manage.py file to actually run certain commands relating to the project. And this first one is going to be Python manage.py migrate. And if you run this, you can see a whole bunch of commands here, and it says that it was running migrations. And all these migrations here were applied. So applying auth, admin, content types, etc. And it runs all these migrations into the database. And now you can see you have a db.sqlite3 file inside that folder, and that is our actual database. And these migrations that it made, these were just the initial migrations that needed to be made so that our project can actually get started. And with those migrations, we can now actually run the project and see it in the browser for the first time. And so we use the manage.py file to run our project on our local host. And the way that you do that is just by saying Python manage.py run server. And now when you do that, it says it's performing the system checks. And then it says it identified no issues. And then I'm getting an older version of Django. And that's actually because I ran it without the Python 3 command. And we'll see how we can handle this slightly better in the next section of the course. But for now, it's not too much of a problem. So we just say manage.py and then run server. And sometimes you might get a little bit of a red error message here. And that's just telling you that you'll need to run Python manage.py migrate to actually apply these migrations. And this is showing up because when I ran migrations for the first time, I was using Python 2. So I'll just write Python 3 manage.py migrate. And then we see these two migrations being applied. So now we can go and run the server again. And now we get no issues and everything is working and it's running on Django version 2.1.4. And it also tells us here that it's starting the development server at this URL, which is your local host 127.0.0.1 port 8000. And you can quit the server using Control-C. So for example, if I Control-C, then the server stops running and we can just call it again to start the server up. And so let's actually click on this link and open it in the browser. And this is what we get. This is like the greeting page from Django to basically let you know that your project is working. And it has some links here at the bottom to the community, a basic tutorial, and the Django documentation. And it says here, you are seeing this page because debug equals true is in your settings file and you have not configured any URLs. And so don't worry if you don't understand what any of that means right now. We're going to jump into that in the next one. So what we're going to do in this video is explore our tutorial folder here, which has all of the project settings inside it. And so let's start by opening the init.py file, and you'll see that this is empty, and that's because this file basically acts as a creator of a module. So it just enables this tutorial folder to act like a module, and that's mainly for Python 2 reasons. So we can just close that, and now we can open settings.py. And this is arguably the most important file when getting started with Django. So let's just close that and work our way through this. So we're importing OS, which is the operating system package, and the first thing we do is create this base directory variable. And what this is doing is it's using the OS module to basically navigate through our project folders and assign the source directory. So you see the source folder, that is what the base directory is, so that we can reference the files inside it. And once we have that, we can use that later on throughout the script to basically define the paths of other files and folders relative to the base directory. And so after that, we have the secret key, which is basically a variable that Django needs to run your application. And every secret key is unique to its project, and it's very important that you keep it secret when your website is live. Then on the same note as that, you have the debug variable, which is basically determining whether or not your project is in debug mode. What it means to be in debug mode is that when there are errors that happen on your server, those errors will be displayed in the browser, and we'll see how that happens. But basically those errors are to help you when you are busy developing your application. So that's a very handy thing when you're busy developing, but when it's in production, you don't want debug to be true because you don't want people to see those errors. So you'll set debug to false when you go live. Then you have the allowed hosts, which is a list of basically hosts or otherwise URLs that allow your project to be run on it. And the first host is your 127.0.0.1 because that is your local host, and that's by default. But you can also come and add in other domains, such as the domain that you actually host your project on. Then you have the installed apps, which right now is just a list of initial apps that Django installs by default for your project, and the same thing for middleware. Inside here, you can add your own custom apps and your own middleware for whatever purposes you'd like to handle. You then have the root URL configuration, and this is referencing the tutorial.urls file, and tutorial is the folder we're in right now. Then URLs is this file here, urls.py, and in here we've configured a URL patterns which Django looks for by default to actually host your project. And so right now we only have the admin path, but you can come and add your own paths to handle other kinds of views. And so in the settings, this is just telling Django where to start looking for those URLs. You then have the templates, which is basically a whole configuration of how Django's templates work. And this is basically where Django looks for HTML templates and how those templates can actually be processed in terms of special context variables that Django understands. And we'll dive into that eventually. You then have the WSGI application, which again is a reference to another file, and this is the wsgi.py. And all it has in here is an application variable, which is calling Django's built-in get WSGI application. And so Django will look for this application variable by default. And basically here it is just referencing it inside the wsgi.py file. So this is basically telling Django this is where the WSGI application is. You then have the databases, and here you can specify different kinds of databases, such as Postgres, MySQL, and other kinds. And the default one is SQLite 3, which you can see here is this DB file here. And this is good for when you're in development, but once you go into production, you'll want to move on to something else. And then you have password validators, which, for example, just check things like how similar the password is to the username, the minimum length, if it's a common password like password, or if it's a numeric password. So those are just validators on the kinds of passwords that your users can actually create. And then you have internationalization, which is just things like language and time zone. And then lastly, you have the static setup, which is for your static files, which is basically things like CSS, JavaScript, and images. And this static URL is basically the URL that Django uses to reference static files in your project. And don't worry if this doesn't make sense yet, you will see this as we go on. So this was just a brief overview of this entire file and all the contents in it, but don't worry if things don't make sense. As you play around with Django and work with some more projects, you will become familiar with the setup. So now that we know a little bit more about how a project is set up, the next important thing to understand is the concept of apps. Now, apps are these installable modular pieces of applications that
contain the logic of one particular thing. So for example, you could have a users app, and in that app, all the logic relating to the users would be contained, such as how their accounts are set up, what data those accounts hold, what URLs you go to log in and sign up, and things like that. And so in this one, we're just going to walk you through the process of creating your own app. So right now we have the server running, and we can just close that. And to create an app, we're going to use our manage.py file. And the command that we use is python manage.py start app, and then we give our app a name. So let's call ours posts, where posts refer to things like blog posts. And you can see that we were given a folder here inside our source project, which is called posts, and that's the name of the app. And if we take a look inside, we have a migrations folder, an init.py file, an admin file, apps, models, tests, and views. And so let's just jump into a couple of these files. So first we have the migrations, and currently we have nothing in it except the init.py file, and that's again just to make sure that it's a module. Then we have the init.py file for the posts app, which is to ensure that the posts app is a module as well. And then we have the admin file, which currently only has one import inside it. We have the apps.py file, which is basically configuring this module to have a name of posts. We then have our models.py file, the tests.py file, and views.py file. And all of them just have one import currently. Now, when you run the start app command, it's going to generate this default folder configuration such as you're seeing for the posts app. And this is because it's become standard practice that when you create an app, you have to have certain things in place, and these files Django looks for in order to ensure that you've correctly set up your app. And what's also very important is that these files were created to help guide users in how to actually create a project with an easy flow of how things work. And we're going to run through that throughout the next few lessons. So in the next one, we can get started with the most important part of an app, which is the models.py file. So in the last one, we talked a little bit about apps, and in this one, we're going to continue with that by jumping into the models of our posts app. Now, it's extremely important to understand that when you create an app, everything that you do inside it will not matter unless you've told Django to actually use this app. And so the way that you do that is by going into your tutorial folder and going to settings.py, and then you can scroll down to the installed apps list. And here is where you want to put the name of your app once you've created it. So in our case, we're going to put posts, just like that. And by doing this, you've basically told Django that this posts folder is one of the installed apps for the project. And so Django needs to look through these files and use them in the project. And so this is a very important step when creating an app. So we can go ahead and close the settings.py file, and we'll jump into the models.py file. Now, models basically hold all of the data that you want to contain in your project relating to some kind of app. So let's imagine that we were creating a blog. And if we think about the kind of data that is held in a blog website, naturally we would think of things like a post, and each post has a title and a description and maybe an author. It would have some kind of timestamp that was given to it when it was created. Maybe we hold all of the comments on that post, all of the likes. So all of that we've just described is basically the data that we would want to contain relating to a post. And so all of that needs to be defined in our models. And these models will help us to control and define exactly how that data should be defined and what kind of data it is as well. So let's work with our post example. And the way that we do this is by inheriting from Django's models import. So Django has imported it here for us when we created the app, and we can get started by creating a class and giving our class a name, and let's just call it a post. And we want to inherit from the models import. Now, when we explore what is contained in the models module, you'll see that there are a ton of different fields here. And what we want to inherit from is the model. So the built-in Django models.model is what we typically use to inherit in our own classes. And once we inherit from the model, we gain access to a library of different kinds of fields that we can use to create our own models. So for example, we said that we wanted to have a title. Now, if we think about a title, in terms of what kind of data it is, this is normally going to be a string. And Django has a built-in field to handle that kind of data, which is called a character field. So we inherit from the models import as well, and we say models dot, and if you search for character field, you'll see that it's shortened to char, so char field, and you can just instantiate it with the brackets and pass in the necessary arguments that are needed for this kind of field. Now for the character field, you have to pass in the maximum length argument. And this is just an integer. It's any kind of length for the string. So for example, we could say 50, and this means that the string cannot be longer than 50 characters. And we can just save that. And with this title field, we can also go ahead and define a method on our class to help represent the model when it's being viewed in the admin and in other places. And we can just say define _string. What this method does is basically define the name of this post in terms of how it is actually viewed. And this is best explained just by seeing what it does. So we'll just pass in self because it is required. And we'll just say return self.title. And so with that, you've actually created your first model. And now you can go into the admin, you can create your own posts and actually see them. But before we do that, we have to understand the process of actually creating models, not only in the models.py file, but actually here in the database. Now, once you create a class, you need to make migrations to the database, which is basically like telling Django, okay, we've created this model, but now we need to actually put that into our database so that we can store data according to the structure. So if you were to just say python manage.py, so what you need to do in your terminal is you need to say python manage.py make migrations. And this command, you can see, gives us an output that says migrations for posts, which is the name of our app. And then here it says posts/migrations/001 initial.py. And if you take a look in the posts app, you've got the migrations folder, which has a new file that was created in it. And that is exactly what was shown over here, 0001 _initial.py. And if we take a look at this, basically what this is doing is it's using Django's migration model to create a migration and basically keep record of it here inside the app. And here you can see the kind of operation that took place. So it says migrations.create model. So a model was created. The name was post. The fields are an ID, which is by default, and the title, which has a character field with a maximum length of 50. And so all this has done is told Django that this migration is ready to be made. So we can go and close that. And once you've made the make migrations call, the next thing you have to do is say migrate. And what this does is basically solidify those migrations into the database. So when we enter that, we see it says applying all migrations in the admin, the auth, content types, posts, and sessions. And then it says running migrations, and it's applying the migrations that we made here from the make migrations call. And it says OK, which means that that migration was successful. And so now that means that in our database, we successfully have that data structure set up. And so in the next one, we can start creating our own posts and actually seeing them in the Django admin. So we just made our first migration to the database, and now we actually want to see this in the admin. Now, in order to see the admin, we have to create ourselves a super user. A super user is basically an admin user. So a user who controls what can be deleted, what can be created, and everything in terms of managing our website. So to create a super user, we'll just clear out the console. And again, we use the manage.py file to do this. So we just say python manage.py create super user, and then it asks us for a username. So I'll just put admin. We can put in an email address, or you can also leave blank. So I'll just leave mine blank. So I'll go ahead and add a password, and then we enter the password again. And here you can see that it gave me this warning, which is saying this password is too short, it must contain at least 8 characters, and it's also too common. Now, because we are in development mode, I'm not too worried about how secure this password is. So I'm just going to press Y, and then it says superuser created successfully. So we can then go ahead and run the server with manage.py run server. And now we can take a look in the browser. So here we have it running. And to go to the admin, we simply just go to /admin. And now you can see that it's brought up this little window, which is the Django administration, and it's asking us to log in. And here you're going to use the details of the super user that you just created. So this will be admin and then your password. And now you are logged in to the Django admin. And this is regarded as one of Django's best features, that all of this actually came for free and is part of the Django experience in helping you get up and running as quick as possible. So you can use this admin to create posts, to create other models, to manage things. And that's very convenient instead of having to do it all by yourself and build this from scratch. Now, here on the left-hand side, you can see all of the models that we have for our application. Now, currently we have the users and we have groups. If we click on users, you can see it brings up a list with some cool stuff. We have a search bar, we have a filtering system here, we have a button that allows us to add a new user, and if you click on that, then you can put in a username and password to actually create your user. And we can also see we have the admin user here as well. And if I click on that, then we get some more information regarding this user. And we can also see things such as the permissions that this user has. We can see things like their last login, the date the user joined, their first name, last name, and email address, etc. And not only can we see the users and the groups, but we can see the other models that we've created. We just have to tell Django where to look for them. And we did that when we created our app. And we told Django that we have an installed app called Posts. Now, when we did that, we basically told Django that it can look through these files when running our application. And one of the files we have here is admin.py. And if you go into it, you can see it says here, register your models here. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to use the default imported admin to register our models. Now, in order to register the post model, we need to import it. So we'll say from .models import post, and then using this model, we will use the admin import and say admin.site.register, and then just pass in post. And if you save this, we can go back into the browser, refresh this, and now you have a new section of posts. And you can click on the posts, and it brings you to the first page, which is the list of posts. And currently we don't have any. So we can go ahead and add a post. And if you click on that, you can see you have one field, which is the title. And if you remember, that was the field on the model that we created. So inside the admin, we can now come and give our post a title and say, this is the first post. And we'll just click save. And look at that. We now have a post, and you can actually see it in the admin. And if you click on it, you can see that there's the post itself with the title field and the data that we gave it. You can delete it, you can edit it, or you could just add another one. So feel free to play around here to try and get the hang of things. And while we have this open in the admin, let's take a look back at the model and just refer back to this define string method. Here we said return self.title, and that is why the title is displayed over here. The title of the model is being used to reference each model when they are being listed out. So for example, we could also say self.id, but then we would need to wrap this inside some strings because an ID is an integer and not a string. So we can just say .format self.id, just like that. And now you can come back and refresh this. And now you can see there's a 1 there. So this string method is basically defining how the model is displayed. So the easiest one would just be self.title. And we can come back and refresh this. And there it is. So now we've learned about our models, how to actually create them. We've learned how to display them and register them in the admin. And we've taken a look at some of the operations that we can perform inside the admin. Now, this is not the only way that you can create your models, and it would be silly if it was. So what we're going to do in this one is introduce you to the Django shell. The shell is basically a Python console in which you can run your commands in Python, and in our case, we'll want to use those commands to do things such as create posts or create users and other things. So let's go and open up the terminal here, and I'm going to stop the server, and we can just clear this. And again, we're going to use the manage.py file. So we'll say python manage.py and then shell. And if you enter, you can see that it's brought up a Python 3.6.5 IPython. And in here, we're going to run through an example of how to use the shell to create a post. So just like how we did it here in the admin, where we used this form and we gave it a title and then saved, we're going to do the same thing here in the shell. And so in order to create our post, we're going to need to import it. So we'll say from posts.models import post. And when we execute that, you can see we get no errors. So now we have the post model imported. And before we create it, let's look at some other things like just displaying all the posts that we currently have. So we'll just say post.objects.all. Don't be worried if you don't understand this syntax or you don't know it yet. This is purely just to demonstrate it to you and get you familiar with some of the commands. So when we execute that, we get a query set, and this is a built-in model from Django, and basically what it is a list of post objects. So a query set returns a list of objects, and you can see that we have one post, and the way it's being displayed is using the title. So we see this is the first post, which is the only post that we have and that we created last time. We can also perform things like get the first element, and you can see now that we didn't get a query set returned, we just got one post model instance returned. And you can also perform things like .last, and because we only have one element in the query set, .first and .last will give us the same thing. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to create a post. So we'll say that p, our post, equals to post.objects.create. And when we create using this particular way, we have to pass in all the fields that are required for the post. So in our case, we need to pass in a title. So we say title equals to, and then we need to make sure that this is a string like that. And we'll say this is the second post. And you can see that it was executed. And if we just enter p, then you can see here's our post object and says this is the second post. We can also create a model in a different way. So we'll just say p equals to post, just like that. And this way we're instantiating a post object, and we can just enter that. And we'll say p.title equals to, this is the third post. And then we just say p.save, which is a method that's built in on the Django model. And you can see that that was executed. And if we check p this time, we see this is the third post. And if we go all the way back to our query set to get all our post objects, you can see now we have 3 in that query set. And you can also access attributes off of your model in the same way as we did when we created it the second way. So when we said p.title equals to this is the third post, you can also see what that title is now. So we can say p.title, and you get this is the third post. We can see p.id, and we see it's got an ID of 3. And so it's important actually to go through the Python shell to see these calls being made using Django. And we're going to use the exact same logic that we did here with our create methods in the next video, where we start creating our own views that will allow us to create posts. So now that we have more of an idea of how to create posts using the syntax we saw in the Python shell, we're going to jump into views, and views will allow us to create the logic behind what is actually going to happen on certain URLs or certain pages of the website. And so let's just run the server for now. And we can bring this down for a second. And we're going to go into our views.py file inside the posts app. And when we come inside here, we can see we already have one import, which is the render command, which is coming from Django's shortcuts. Now there are 2 ways you can create a view. you can either use a function or you can use a class. Now classes are a little bit more advanced and eventually we'll go into them. So for the time being, we're going to introduce function-based views. And the way that we get started with this is just by defining it as we normally would when creating a function. And let's get started with our list view. So we'll just call this list posts and we'll say that it takes in a request. Now all of our views most likely will have to take in a request because we need to basically determine what we want to do with that request and what we want to send as a response. The most basic way that we can do this right now is by using the render import. So we'll say return render, and the render takes in the request. So we'll pass in the request that we were given. It then takes in a template name, and this is going to be a string. So we'll just say this is post list.html, and then it takes in some context, which is equal to none by default. So we'll just pass in an empty dictionary like so. And basically what this is doing is it's taking in the request from the user. So for example, let's say that our user went to /posts, then that would be a GET request. So the user wants to get the data that's displaying on the posts URL. Then here our list posts function will take in that request and it's going to return the user our post list HTML page that we'll create in a second and pass in the request as an additional parameter to handle this HTML file being sent back. So there's a few things that we need to set up in order to get this working. First, we're going to take our function and we're going to bring it into our tutorial folder inside the urls.py. And what we're going to do is import it. So we'll say from posts.views import list posts, which is the name of the function. And then we're going to create a path that will use the list posts function to handle the request when it's being made. So we'll just add a path here. And let's say that we want this to be posts, and we'll end it off with a slash like that. And then we put a comma and then our function to actually handle requests on this path. So we just put our list posts function just like that. And now we can go and head over to that URL. So we'll just go to /posts and you are greeted with your first error screen. And this is a feature of Django that is active right now because our project is in debug mode. And you can see this inside the settings.py file. If you go to the top, you have this debug keyword. And if you set it to equal to false and come back here and refresh this, then you're going to get a server error with a status of 500. Now this is what a user will see when your project is hosted on your domain, because you don't want them to see those errors. But while we're in our development mode, we want this to be true so that we can see what those errors are. So we can come back here and refresh this, and we see that it's a template does not exist at this URL, and the template that does not exist is postlist.html. And here you can find all the information regarding this error. So for example, the Django version, Python version, the Python path, and the traceback that goes all the way back to the point where the error actually occurred. And this is in the render method that was returned in our view. And you can see the path to the actual view right here. It says source posts and views.py in list posts, the name of the function. And so basically our post list HTML file does not exist. And that's right, we haven't actually created it yet. So what we're going to do inside the posts folder is we're going to add a templates folder. So we'll just create it like that. And inside the templates directory, you're going to create another folder, which is the name of your app. So in our case, posts. So just like that, inside templates. And inside posts, you're going to create the name of the HTML file, which will be post list.html. And here's where you will then create the HTML that you want to display on that path. Now, before we do that, let's go back into the view and change the path to this file to be posts/postlist.html. And then in here, we can just add an h1 tag and say, welcome to the post list page, just like that. And if we come in here, you can see now we're getting welcome to the post list page being displayed on our posts URL. So let's run through everything that just happened. inside views.py we created a function. It takes in a request and we render that request using the post list HTML file that we created. Now the request is passed in from the URL. Here in the URL patterns, we added a path that says whenever a user goes to posts, use the list posts function to handle that request. So Django behind the scenes is taking the request and passing it into this function. And there we then handle it ourselves. We then created the post list HTML file, and specifically inside the templates and posts directories with this structure, because this is where Django actually looks for the templates by default inside an app. And we'll look at another way that we can create templates as well. And we'll also look at another way that we can specify where Django must look for its templates. But so this is how we create views. We create them inside the views.py file, and we reference those views to handle the requests inside our URLs. The view then references an HTML file to display the result that we wanted to display. So far what we've taken a look at is the models, and we've seen how we can create functions that take in a request from a user and then display some HTML on a certain path. And so it's very important to start connecting the dots as to how your flow of information works inside Django. So it all starts with the models. We define what kind of data we want to have in our project and how we're going to store that and what kind of fields we're going to use to store that. Once we've created the models, we then go to the views. The views are going to handle how that request is handled and what data we want to give back to the user. And the URLs is simply just where the user needs to go to see that data. So that flow of information is extremely important in understanding how Django works. And once you can understand that, working with Django becomes a breeze, because you'll follow the same process of creating models, creating functions to handle the data that's held in those models, and creating URLs to handle where that data is actually displayed. So what we're going to do in our views.py is we're going to edit this list posts function a little bit. Now using our render command, we're passing in the request and we're passing in the path to the HTML file. But what about this last parameter here? You can see it's just an empty dictionary. Well, why is that? This is meant to be some context. So we'll just add context there. And context is a dictionary of keys and values that references data that we want to actually bring into our HTML templates. So what we're going to do is define a context variable, which will be a dictionary. And before we add anything to it, let's think about what we want to actually display. Well, we've called this function the list posts function. So maybe a better name would be post list. And we can just take that post list function and come back into tutorial, urls.py, and make sure that we import it correctly with post list, and then reference it as the function for the posts path. Then what we want to do is we want to grab all of the posts from our models and display those posts on the post list HTML page. So remember when we were working in the Python shell and we could use the command post.objects.all to grab all the post objects, and we got that as a query set that was returned to us? Well, we can do the same thing here. So we're going to say from.models import post. So now we have the post model, and inside our function we're going to get all of the post objects. So we'll say posts equals to post.objects.all. And so what we want to do is we want to take our posts here and pass it into our HTML file so that we can display that data there. And the way that we do that is through context. Context is what we use to define the keys and the values that correspond to those keys. So for example, here we'll say this is our post list. So this is the key, and then the value is our posts, which is the query set that we just got here from the objects.all query. And now what we're doing is we're passing in this context into our render method, which is basically saying, take the request, render it on the post list HTML page, but also be aware of this context dictionary, which is basically like some special variables that we can define inside the post list HTML page. So let's go ahead and jump into that file now. We can go to postlist.html, and here we're going to start working with Django templates. And this is a very big part of Django in how it interprets and renders templates. And if you actually remember, inside our tutorial settings.py, we had a whole bunch of settings for these templates. And here we have the context processes. And these context processes are basically used to interpret the templates, because these templates are not just HTML files. They're actually much more than that. They can actually understand variables. So here you can see you've got two different template processes. You've got the debug context processor and the request context processor. And so that is what allows us to actually define variables in our HTML. And so the way that we pass context into our HTML files is by using the double curly braces syntax, like this. And inside the double curly braces syntax, you can pass in the variable name that was passed into the context. So here we said that the post list is equal to the posts query set here in the view. So this post list key is what we can use as a variable inside our HTML file. So if we just put post list like this and come back to the browser and refresh it, you can see that we get some text displaying here, which is just this query set of posts, and we can see all three posts inside there. Now that's not a great way to display information, but the key thing here is how we're passing in a context variable from our view into the HTML page. And that is actually quite amazing, because we can go in our view and grab any kind of data from our models and pass that data into the view, which is then displayed on our HTML page. And so jumping back here into our HTML file, we can actually loop through the post list in the same way that you would use a for loop in normal Python. You can do the same thing with context variables. Now the way that we perform special operations like a for loop is by using the curly braces with a percentage sign. So inside these percentage signs is where you would put the special operator. So for example, a for loop, and we could say for post in post list, like that. And the key thing here is that whenever you create a for loop, you need to end it. So you have to say end for, like that. And now inside this for loop, inside these context variables, you can then reference the post variable that we created using the double curly braces syntax like we did above. So you can just say post, and then we can get rid of that up top there. And if we come back in here and refresh this, now you see this is the first post, this is the second post, this is the third post. And to show you how you can combine this with normal HTML, you could add an unordered list and wrap that around the for loop. And inside the for loop, you could then create a list item like this. And if we come back here and refresh this, now you have a list of posts. And again, we didn't need to say post.title because by default our model was doing that with the defined string method. So if you had this as the ID, so again we'll just show it using .format self.id, and then just get rid of that title there and refresh this. Now you can see you get 1, 2, 3. So in this case you could say .title, and that way it will return the title of that post, or you could just say return self.title in the defined string method, and then in the post list just say return post. And if you come back, it's the same thing. So now all we've done is we've explored how we can pass in context into a function and use that context as special variables that are interpreted by Django's template processes. So in this last one, we're going to talk a little bit more about URLs and paths. Inside the tutorial folder, you have the root URL configuration, which is inside urls.py. And in here, you specify the URL patterns, which is a list of paths that basically handle what URLs users need to go to and what function needs to handle the request when a user goes there. Once you start having multiple apps in your project, you can imagine that this URL patterns could get pretty long. And so it then becomes important to self-contain your URLs for each app inside its own app. And the way that we can do this is by using another function that we can import from Django's URLs, which is the include function. And include basically is used to reference another app's URLs file. So what we could do for the path of posts is we could say for any URL that goes to posts, include the posts URLs. And we pass this in using strings and just reference the app. So posts.urls, just like that. And now we can get rid of the import of the post list and actually go inside our posts app and create a urls.py file here that will handle the URLs for this app. So we'll add urls.py and we'll get started with creating a URL patterns, which is a list that will contain some paths. And we can add the import of our view. So we'll say from.views import post list, and we'll say from Django.urls import path. And then we can create a path over here, and we'll specify the path as just an empty string like this. And then we can add a comma and use our post list to handle what happens when we go to this empty string. Now, this empty string is not just going to slash like this. That's going to give you an error. Instead, the include command is saying whenever anyone goes to slash posts, anything from this point on, so from posts slash, let's say slash list or slash create, slash update, etc., anything after slash posts, use the post URLs to handle that. So here we could say, for example, list. And that way, if we go to slash posts, now we get an error, but it's saying posts slash list is an optional path. And you could go to post slash list, and now you get the list of posts. So this is how we can self-contain our own URLs inside our own app, which is a little bit better because then our root URL configuration will not be as cluttered with every URL of our project. Instead, we can reference the URLs of each app to be handled inside its own urls.py file. And we could then get rid of the list just like that. And basically what that means is that if we go to slash posts with nothing on the end of it, we then get the post list display. So what we're going to do in this section is create a blog project. We're going to show you how you can create all of the CRUD based views. The CRUD acronym stands for create, retrieve, update, and delete. So we're going to run through all the views to handle a basic blog application in which we can create posts, display a list of those posts, grab each post individually, create a post, update a post, and delete a post. So in this one, let's just get started with creating a project. And before we do that, I'm going to introduce you to Virtual Env. Virtual Env is a package that you can install using pip, which basically is used to store your project requirements inside a virtual environment. And this way, you will not be installing the dependencies to your actual machine, but instead you'll be storing them in a folder which can be accessed directly inside your project. So to install it, you can just say pip install virtual env, and it will install it for you. I already have mine installed. And so once you have yours installed, you can just type virtual env and then the name of your environment, which I'll just call env. And now you can see you get an env folder in your project. And this will store all the packages that are required. So to activate it on Mac and Linux, you can type source and then the name of your virtual environment. So env bin and then activate. On Windows, you can type env and then scripts activate like this. And once you do that, then you will see you get a bracket with env, the name of our virtual environment, to the left here of our terminal. And that is signaling that your virtual environment is activated. And so with that activated, you can then install the dependencies of your project. So for example, we could say pip install Django, and then it will install the latest version of Django for this project and store it inside the env folder. And then we can just go and say Django admin start project, and we'll call this the blog. And now we have the blog project there, which I'll rename the top folder to be called source. And we have the env folder and source folder. I'll change into the source folder. And I can then say manage.py, and we will say migrate to make the initial migrations of the project. And then I will say create super user, so we can create our admin user. So there we go. Now we have the super user created. And now I'll just say manage.py run server. And we can take a look at this in the browser. And there we go. We have our project up and running. And so in the next one, we can get started with creating our models and our new apps. So we have our project running, and I'm just going to close the server for now. And we'll get started with creating our first app, which we'll call the posts. So we'll say manage.py start app and call it posts. There we have the posts folder, and then inside blog settings, we can then go into our installed apps. And in here, I will just add posts, and I get this prompt to install the PyLint linter, which is basically for syntax highlighting. So I'm going to install that. And I'm just going to close the settings now, and we'll head over to posts. And in the posts models, we'll get started with creating our first model, which will be called the post. So we'll just say post, which inherits from models.model. We'll give it a title, and we'll give it some content, and say the title is a models.character field, and we'll say the maximum length is 40. We'll set the content equal to a text field, which is another kind of field, similar to a character field, except there's no limit to the number of characters. And then we'll say define string, and we'll say it takes in self, and it returns self.title. Now we can make migrations, so we'll say manage.py make migrations, and there we see the migration file was created, and we can say manage.py migrate. Cool, so that's the model we're going to work with for now. In the next one, we can get started with our views. So now we've got our model created, and I'm just going to clear the console out, and we'll just say manage.py run server, and we can bring that down, and we'll go into the admin. So we'll register those models there. So we'll say from .models import the post, and then we'll just say admin.site.register post. We'll then go into our views, and we'll get started with creating a post list view. So we'll say from .models import post. We'll say define post list. We'll say it takes in a request. We'll then say our posts equal to post.objects.all. We'll create a context dictionary where we'll specify the post list to be the posts that we just grabbed on our post model. And then we'll just say return a render of that request. We'll pass in post list.html and pass in our context. We can then take our post list view, and we'll create a urls.py file inside the posts app. And in here we'll say from Django.urls import path. We'll then set our URL patterns equal to a list with the first path going to just slash, and then we'll say from .views import the post list, and we'll use the post list to handle requests on this path. And then in the blog inside the URLs, we can remove the first comment there, and we'll import include from Django's URLs, and we'll create another path that goes to posts, and then say include posts.urls. And now lastly, we just need to sort out the actual template, but this time instead of creating the templates directory inside the posts app, what I'm going to do is create a templates directory inside the source folder. So we'll just say templates, and inside there we'll create our post list.html. We'll say welcome to the post list, and we will just loop through each post in the post list. So we'll just close the URLs for now. And if we go to the view, we have the post list key, which we use to loop through. So we'll say for post in post list, we'll return a list item with the post object, and then just say end for, and wrap all of that with an unordered list. And now we need to tell Django that it needs to look inside this templates directory. So inside the blog settings, we can scroll all the way down to our templates configuration, and inside the DIRs key, this is a list of directories in which Django must look for templates. So we can just say look inside os.path.join, and we'll join the base directory with our templates directory. And so now we have the server running. So we'll go to /posts, and we see that we get it displaying welcome to the post list, but there are no posts showing, and that's because we don't have any posts in the database. So let's go to the admin, and we'll just log into the admin. We'll go to add a new post, and we'll say this is the first post, and here is some content, and we'll just save that, go back to our posts, and there is our first post. So we've got our first view working, which is the post list, and all we're doing is looping through the post list query set that we grabbed here inside our function, and just displaying a list item with each post. And so what we're going to do now is add the detail view for each post. What this means is that each view particularly shows the data relating to each instance of a post. And the way that we normally do this is by either using the ID or by using a slug. So for example, if I went to /posts/1, then what we would want this to do is take us to the post that has an ID of 1. And if we went to /2, then this would be the post that has an ID of 2, and etc. So this is a way that we differentiate between the posts, and that we can get the data relating to each individual post. So what we need to do is define a function to handle that. So we'll go to our views, and we'll say define post detail. It'll take in a request, and it's also going to take in an ID, because this is the way that we're going to filter our posts to get the data relating to a specific post. So then here we can say that our post equals to post.objects. And now we're not saying .all because we don't want to get all of them. We want to get the unique one that we're looking for, which is having an ID of whatever ID is passed into here. So we just say .get, and inside this .get method, you can pass in a query to basically filter the post objects. So we'll basically say get the post that has an ID of ID. So ID is the field we're filtering by, and this ID is the ID that was passed into the function. And now we can say context equals to post, and then we'll just set this equal to the post that we just grabbed, and we will just copy this render statement here and just say return a render to post detail.html with that context. Now we can take the post detail function, go into our URLs, we'll import it there, and we'll say when a user goes to a path that has an ID, then use the post detail. And the way that we pass in an ID into the path is by using these brackets like this, and inside passing in the name of the field that's being passed into the URL. So in this case, going to an ID would be like going to /posts/1 or /2, etc. And this ID has to match the name of the argument that is going inside our post detail function. So this could be, for example, post ID, and then we filter our objects where the ID equals to the post ID, and then the URLs has to have a post ID inside these brackets here to identify that as the argument that is required in the path. Then we can go to our templates and create post detail.html, and this will be very similar to the post list, so we'll just copy that and paste it there, but we don't need the unordered list, and we just need something to display our post. And what we'll do is display the post content, because remember that is a field on the model, and then we'll just add an h4, which is the post title. So now if we go to, for example, posts 1, then you can see this is the first post, and here is some content. and that confirms that our detail view is working because we're going to a URL that has a post ID being passed into it. The post detail function is handling the request and is receiving the post ID as an argument to that function, which is used to filter the post objects and pass that corresponding post into the context to display in the HTML page. So now we have the post list and the post detail views working, and we're now going to work on creating a post create view. Now, one of the things we haven't talked about yet are forms, and forms are used to create or update objects. And in some cases, they can actually be very simple. So what we're going to do is create a forms.py file inside our posts app. And inside here, we're going to import the forms module from Django. So we'll say from Django, import forms. And this is very similar to the models that we see are imported from Django.db. Everything that we need to use in terms of creating forms can be inherited from Django's forms. And we do this in the same sort of way as how we would do this when we created a model. We inherit from the models.model and we specify the fields on the model. Well, it's the same kind of concept for a form. We can create a class and we'll call this the post form. We'll say that it inherits from forms dot, and here we have two kinds of forms. We can either inherit from the model form or from the default form. Now the form requires a little bit more customization to get it to work, so we're going to rather use the model form because it's very easy to set up. And so all you need to do is specify the class meta, which is basically information about what this class is inheriting from. So we just have to specify the model, and this is the post. So we just need to import that post and say from.models import post and specify that as the model in our class meta. And then lastly, we have to specify the fields of the form. So the fields is a list of fields that are specified on the model. And in our case, we have the title and we have the content. So in here, we want both of those fields to display. So we just add them in there and we just wrap them with inverted commas so that they become strings. And that way we've defined the fields that must display on our form. Of course, you could also remove the content or the title so that only one of the fields displayed. But in our case, we want both of the fields to display. And so that's it. That's our form. And all we need to do now is just take this form and use it in our view. So we'll come down here and say define post create, and we'll say that it takes in a request. Note that we don't need to pass in any extra parameters because all the data will come through in our request. So we'll get started by grabbing our post form. So we'll say from.forms import the post form. And then down here, we'll set this equal to our form. So we'll say form equals to post form. And what we're going to do is pass in the request, but not just the request. We only want to pass in the request if the method is .post. So what that means is that you have to send a post request to this view in order to create something. And that is how it works generally in terms of HTTP calls. If you want to create something on a server, you have to send a post request. If you want to retrieve something, you send a GET request. So what we do is we say either it's a request.post or it's none. Meaning, if it's not a request.post, then don't create an instance of the post form. And then we can use a method on the form, which is the .isValid method. And what this does is it looks at the data that came through into our form via the post request, and it checks, does this match the fields that are required on the post form? And if it does, then it's considered valid. And so once it's valid, we can then create an instance of our post. And we can simply do this just by saying form.save. So what that will do is it will use the save method on our model form, which is a method on the form that inherits from the model form. So basically Django is taking care of that in the back. And it takes the fields that were sent through in the form and saves that as a new instance of the post in the database. Now remember, all of this logic takes place if it was a post request, what we need to do is ensure that we still have some context that's going through when there's a GET request. What that means is that the form needs to be displayed via the context. So we can say the context equals to, and we'll just set the key to be a form, and this will be equal to the form that's created as an instance of the post form, and then we'll just say return a render of that request to post create.html and pass in that context. And actually, instead of even creating an instance variable, we can simply just say form.save to simply just save the data that came through in the form. So now what we're doing is we're handling the post request, but we're also handling the GET request by passing in the context into our request and displaying the post create HTML page, which will use the form as a context variable. So we can create the post create.html, and we can also go to our urls.py and import post create, and then just create a new path here, which will go to /create, and then just pass in post create. And I'm going to put this above the post detail one, and then we'll just copy everything from the post detail HTML, and we'll go into post create, and then we'll say welcome to the post create page. And then here we're going to create an HTML form. We're going to set the method of the form equal to post, and we're going to put our form, which is coming through, as our context variable. We'll then also add a button and say that the type equals to submit, and we'll just say create post, and we'll save that, and we'll come back in here and then just say go to posts/create, and now you can see that we get a form that has a title field, a content field, and a create post button. And yes, it's a horrible looking form, but it's a form nonetheless. And what you can actually do is change the way that the form is rendered by just saying .asp, and then if you come back, now you can see that it was rendered almost stacked on top of each other, and this .asp basically means .as paragraph. We also need to specify the action, and the action is basically specifying what URL path we need to post this request to. And to post it to the current URL, you just say dot. So that means post it to where we are right now. And that's exactly what we want, because the view is handling it like that. So let's see what happens when we submit the form. So we'll say this is a test with some content, and we'll just inspect to check the console. And if we click create post, you see you get a forbidden 403 with a CSRF verification that failed. Now the CSRF is a security token that's used to validate post requests, and it's extremely important that you include these tokens in your post request forms. And it's very easy to do this. You simply just add a special context variable with the percentage signs and just say add CSRF token, just like that. Then we can come back in here, refresh the page, add some test and dummy content. We click create post, and we see that the request went through. We can come back in here, refresh this, and we see that our test post is there with the test title and the dummy content. And just to make this even better, once the form is submitted, we can actually redirect the user back to the post list view so that it doesn't look like we actually didn't submit the form. And the way that we can do that is just by going back into the views and using one of Django's built-in functions. So we'll say from django.http import HTTP response redirect, and in here we just say if the form is valid, we'll say form.save and say HTTP response redirect, and we're going to redirect back to / just like that, and just make sure that we say return. So what that will do is it will end the function and ensure that we do return the HTTP response redirect. So now let's go back and we'll just add some new data. So we'll refresh this and say create post, and we were redirected to /. And although this might not be the best URL, we could just say go to /posts, which is slightly better. So now we've got our post create working, and in the next one we can get our post update working as well. So we've got the post create view working now, and we're going to now get started with the post update view. So we'll just say define post update, and this is going to take a request, and it's also going to take an ID. And this is because in order to update a post, we need to pass in the ID of that post so that we can grab it and actually work with it. Now what we're going to do is set our post equal to the post.objects.get, where the ID equals to the ID, and then we're going to populate our form in the same way that we did up top here with the create view. We're going to just populate the form with the data that we already have. So we just say the form equals to post form, and we pass in the request.post or none because it is a request post, and then we pass in the instance, and you can see that this is one of the prompted arguments for the post form. And all we do is set the instance equal to the post that we just grabbed. And it's important that the type of instance is the model that corresponds to the model form that you've created. So in this case, the post is the only kind of instance that we can pass through into the post form. And then we can do the same kind of check like we did over here. We'll say if the form is valid, then we'll say form.save, and we'll return an HTTP response redirect. And then again, we will return a render, but this time we're going to keep the HTML file as post create, because as you can see, the only difference between the post update and post create is that the form takes an instance. And so we just need to remember to pass in the context as well. And there we go. So our post update and post create views are actually very similar. And now we can take that post update view, bring it into our URLs, and then I'm just going to copy the post detail path, but this time we'll specify the post update as the function, and we can import these over multiple lines. And then just remember that for the post update, we need to pass in an ID field inside our path so that it can be passed into our view function like so. And we're going to use the post create HTML file to handle this. And what we can actually do is go inside our views and specify something inside the context so that the type of page that's being displayed here will change depending on what kind of form is being displayed. So instead of saying it's the create page every single time, we'll say this is the form type, and we'll just copy that and replace create there as well. And then we'll go back to the view, and then just remember to specify form type inside strings and set it equal to, for the post create, to create, and then for the post update we set it equal to update. And now we can come back in here, we'll go back to /posts, and we have 3 posts there. I'll go to /1/update, and that's because our URLs were set up incorrectly. So instead we'll use the post ID, and I see that I specified ID twice, whereas this should rather be a keyword. We'll say something like update, and then the post ID we can take into our post update like this, and query the post objects according to that post ID. Now if we come back in there, we can then change the URL to be posts/1, and that'll take you to the first post. And then if you go to /update from there, then you can see that you get the form and the data was pre-populated into the fields. So for example, we could say this is the first edited post with edited content, and if we update, now you can see that the title has changed, and you can go back to /1, and it says this is the first edited post. Here's some content with edited content. Cool, so that is our post update view working. In the last one, we can add our post delete view. And so we've created 4 views so far. We've got the post list view, post detail, post create, and post update. And lastly, we're going to add the post delete view. So we'll just come down here and just say define post delete, and it's going to take a request, and it's going to take in an ID, because again we need to pass in the ID of the post that we want to delete. And then we'll just say that the post equals to post.objects.get, where the ID equals to, and we'll just actually use post ID again like that. To delete a post, it's actually extremely simple. The method is actually built into every single model, and you can simply just say post.delete, just like that. And that will delete that object from the database, and we can then return an HTTP response redirect to /posts. So we'll take the post delete view, bring it into our views, and then we'll take our post update path and just change this to be post delete. And instead of being update, this will be delete as well. And then we can go back in here. And if we want to delete posts number 1, then we just go to /1/delete. And now you can see it's gone. And let's say we go to /2, then we have test dummy. And if I say go to /delete, then only the third one's left. And so there we have it. We've successfully implemented all of the CRUD views to list them, to retrieve an individual instance, to create them, to update them, and to delete them.